The bar was a graveyard of broken dreams, the kind of place where the air smelled like stale beer and regret. I sat in the corner, my fingers tracing the rim of my whiskey glass, my eyes scanning the room like a hawk circling its prey. I knew I was handsome, sharp jawline, easy smile, eyes that sparkled with just the right amount of danger. But beneath the charm was something darker, something rotten. I hated this town. It was too small, too quiet, too ordinary. I missed the chaos of my old life, the way I could twist people until they broke, the way they always came crawling back no matter how badly I hurt them. But she had ruined that. She had left me, disappeared into the night without a word, and taken my control with her. Her. The thought of her made my jaw tighten. She had been weak, fragile, the perfect victim, until she wasn't. I could still see her face, pale and trembling, as she packed her bags that final night. I'd tried to stop her, of course. I'd grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a bruise and hissed threats that should have made her stay. But she'd looked at me with something I hadn't seen before, defiance, and then she was gone. I took a long swig of my whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the anger simmering in my chest. I didn't need her. I didn't need anyone. But I needed something. Someone to control. Someone to break. That's when she walked in. The door creaked open, and for a moment the noise of the bar seemed to fade. She stood in the doorway, her dark hair clinging to her face like she'd been caught in the rain. Though the night was dry, her eyes darted around the room, not scared exactly, but hunted. She didn't belong here in this dive on the edge of nowhere, and that's what drew me to her. She was pretty in a way that made me think of porcelain dolls, delicate, fragile, easy to crack. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. A shadow in her eyes, a tension in her shoulders, like she was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. I straightened in my seat, my charm slipping into place like a well-worn mask. I watched as she hesitated at the bar, her fingers trembling as she ordered a drink. The bartender handed her a glass of red wine, and she clutched it like a lifeline, her knuckles white. I waited until she was alone before making my move. "Rough night?" I asked, sliding into the seat beside her. She flinched, her eyes snapping to mine, and for a moment I thought she might bolt. But then she smiled, a small, nervous thing that didn't reach her eyes. "You could say that," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I'm Ethan," I said, extending a hand. She hesitated before taking it. Her skin was cold, almost unnaturally so. "Lila," she said. We talked for hours, or at least it felt that way. I was good at this, drawing people in, making them feel special, making them trust me. But Lila was different. She was quiet, reserved, like she was holding something back. "So, what brings you to this charming town?" I asked, my tone light, teasing. She looked down at her glass, her fingers tracing the rim. "I needed a fresh start," she said. "From what?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the door as if expecting someone to walk in. "It's complicated." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm good with complicated." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you are." The conversation continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just her skittishness or the way she avoided my questions. It was the way the air seemed to grow colder when she spoke, the way the lights flickered whenever she laughed. A hollow, joyless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. At one point, I reached for her hand and she recoiled like she'd been burned. "Sorry," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I'm just not used to this." "Used to what?" I asked, my tone gentle, though my patience was wearing thin. "Kindness," she said, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Well, you're in luck. I'm full of kindness." It happened as we were leaving the bar. I offered to walk her home, and she hesitated before nodding. The streets were empty, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the shadows.
Ethan.
I froze, my head snapping toward the sound. Did you hear that? Lila shook her head, her expression blank. Hear what? I stared at her, searching for any sign that she was lying, but her face gave nothing away. Nothing, I said, forcing a smile. Just the wind. But as we walked, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, until they were inside my head, screaming.
You can't run, Ethan.
I couldn't stop thinking about her. Lila was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Mysterious, fragile, and just broken enough to make me feel powerful. I told myself it was just another game, another conquest, but there was something about her that got under my skin. She was a puzzle I couldn't solve, a lock I couldn't pick, and it drove me mad. We spent more time together over the next few days. I took her to dinner at the only decent restaurant in town, a dimly lit place with flickering candles and a menu that hadn't changed since the 80s. She picked at her food, her eyes darting around the room like she was expecting someone to walk in. "You're not eating," I said, my tone light but with an edge of irritation. She looked up, startled, and forced a smile. "I'm not very hungry." "You're always not hungry," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What's the deal? You on some kind of diet?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "I just don't eat much." I studied her, my eyes narrowing. There was something she wasn't telling me, something big, and it gnawed at me. I hated secrets unless they were my own. "You know," I said, my voice dropping to a low, intimate tone, "you can trust me. Whatever it is, you can tell me." She looked at me, her eyes wide and almost pleading, and for a moment I thought she might break. But then she looked away, her shoulders stiffening. "There's nothing to tell," she said softly. My jaw tightened, but I forced a smile. "All right, but when you're ready, I'm here." The whispers started again that night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it, a faint, guttural murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I sat up, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. "Lila," I called, my voice trembling. No answer, of course. Lila wasn't here. The whispers grew louder, more insistent until they were inside my head, a cacophony of voices I couldn't understand. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within. "Stop," I hissed, my voice barely a whisper. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room was silent, the only sound the ragged rhythm of my breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, my eyes darting around the room, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next day, I went to see Lila. She was staying in a small, run-down motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls were paper-thin and the air smelled like mildew. I knocked on her door, and she opened it a crack, her eyes wide and wary. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," I said, forcing a smile. "Can I come in?" She hesitated before nodding and stepping aside. The room was sparse, the only personal touch, a small suitcase lying open on the bed. "Nice place," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Lila," I said, my voice softening. "What's going on with you? You've been acting strange." She looked up, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out to touch her arm. She flinched, pulling away like my touch burned. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. My patience snapped. "What the hell is your problem?" I demanded, my voice rising. I've been nothing but nice to you, and you're acting like I'm some kind of monster." She stared at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But then she smiled, a small, sad thing that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't understand," she said softly. "You can't. I think you should leave." My hand twitched, the urge to strike her burning in my veins like a live wire. Just one small slap, that's all it would take. I could almost feel the sting of my palm against her cheek, the way she'd flinch, the way she'd finally understand who was in control. But no, not yet. It was too soon. I clenched my jaw, nodded sharply, and walked away, leaving her standing there, oblivious to how close she'd come to learning her place. That night, the whispers returned. I was in my apartment, pacing the floor, when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of nails scraping against stone. I froze, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No answer. The growl grew louder, more insistent, until it was inside my head, a voice I couldn't ignore. I stumbled back, my hands pressed to my ears, but it didn't help. The voice was everywhere, echoing through the room, through my mind, until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the rest, moving across the wall. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was alive, writhing like smoke, reaching for me. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow lunged and I screamed. When I woke up, I was on the floor, my body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, the only sound the ragged rhythm of my breathing. But I wasn't alone. Lila stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Are you okay?" I stared at her, my mind racing. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "I heard you scream." My jaw tightened. "How did you get in?" She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Lila," I said, my voice sharp. "What the hell is going on?" She looked up, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or regret. "I told you," she said softly. "You can't run." I clawed my way up off the floor, my body trembling with rage and fear. The whispers were constant now, a low, guttural murmur that followed me everywhere. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed to carry my name.
Ethan.
I spun around, my heart pounding, but Lila didn't move. She just stood there, watching, her expression unreadable. "Stop," I hissed, my voice trembling. "Just stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were inside my head, a cacophony of voices I couldn't understand. I stumbled around my apartment, finally pressing my back against the wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the light switch. The room was silent, the only sound the ragged rhythm of my breathing. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "You don't want to know," Lila whispered menacingly. But then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving across the wall. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was alive, writhing like smoke, reaching for me. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was Lila standing there watching as the darkness swallowed me whole.
I was home. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows black and empty, like the hollow eyes of a skull. The wind hissed through the trees, carrying faint laughter. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. I stood in the hallway, my pale face glowing faintly in the moonlight. My dark hair clung to my cheeks, and my wide, unblinking eyes gave me the look of a porcelain doll. I tilted my head, listening to the whispers only I could hear. Yes, I murmured, my voice soft but steady. I understand. The spirits had chosen me. They had drawn me to this place, this house, for a reason. I was like them, broken, abused, abandoned. I had run from my own demons only to find myself in the arms of something far worse, or perhaps far better. I had always known the world was unfair. I had learned that lesson early, in the bruises my father left on my mother's arms, in the way my teachers turned a blind eye to the boys who tormented me in the schoolyard. I had learned it in the way men looked at me, their eyes hungry, their hands always reaching for something I didn't want to give. But the house was different. It had shown me the truth that the world was full of monsters, and sometimes the only way to stop them was to become a monster yourself. At first, I had been afraid. The whispers had terrified me, and the faces in the walls had haunted my dreams. But then, I had listened, really listened, and I had heard their stories. Stories of pain, of betrayal, of lives cut short by cruelty and greed. They were like me. They had suffered, just as I had suffered. They had been powerless, just as I had been powerless. But now they had power. And so did I. The first time I had helped them, it had been an accident. I had been walking down the street, my mind filled with whispers, when I had seen him. A man, his face twisted in anger, his hand raised to strike the woman beside him. I had frozen, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. And then, without thinking, I had reached out, not with my hands, but with something deeper, something darker. The man had stumbled, his eyes wide with fear, and then he had fallen, his body convulsing as the shadows closed in around him. I had watched, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I had expected to feel guilt, or fear, or something, but instead I had felt nothing. No, that wasn't quite true. I felt justice. Now, as I stood in the hallway of the house, my fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper. It rippled beneath my touch, like water disturbed by a stone. "He's gone," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "He can't hurt anyone else." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled my head, a cacophony of voices I couldn't ignore.
Good. Now, bring us more.
I turned and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to lean in, the faces watching me, their hollow eyes burning with hunger. "Soon," I whispered, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a promise. "Soon, there will be more." And then I was gone, swallowed by the shadows, my laughter echoing through the empty halls. The house stood silent once more, its windows dark and empty. But if you listened closely, you could hear it, the faint sound of whispers, growing louder, more insistent, until they were almost a scream. The walls were watching, the walls were waiting, and soon they would be free.